The square woke with a tremor, not of the body, but of the world. Tuesday morning poured in like a rain of pale neon over brick and glass dumpling clouds, a chorus of hover drones buzzing through the air like persistent thoughts. The city calligraphy slid across every surface. Billboards, benches, the rain-streaked windows of the old municipal hall. People moved through it with the practiced rhythm of people who have learned to breathe twice. Inhale for the ordinary. Exhale for the strange, and the square flickered, just for a heartbeat. The world shivered and changed its mind. A child's bicycle paused on its wheels, as if the ground had whispered a new gravity. A street vendor's umbrella snapped from blue to coral, the fabric wrinkling like a living map. The pigeons froze mid-flight, wings trembling with a fluttering, half-recognized memory. The flicker wasn't random. It was a doorway, a seam between realities, and it ran through the square like a fault line. On the north side, behind a low arcade of stone and glass, a gray kiosk blinked into existence, a medical technology thing that did not belong to the ordinary cityscape. The neural bridging kiosk, they called it, in the blur of news feeds and graffiti, a node that could tie minds across layers of time and space, letting somebody borrow someone else's sights, someone else's memories, even someone else's sense of self, for a moment or for a lifetime. The kiosk hummed with a pale blue light. A ring of microscreens flickered across its surface, showing a carousel of faces and voices from a dozen different geographies, all trying to speak through the same shared breath. Zara stood a pace back from the kiosk, breathing through the ache of a pulsing refusal in her ribs. She wore a jacket the color of winter steel, patched with the unlikely greens of a garden that refused to die. Her hair, cut sharp at the cheeks, caught a midnight glint, and her eyes, a strange stubborn blue-green, burned with the determined light of someone who has learned too much and refuses to forget. Her tattooed wrists bore the marks of a rebellion that already felt ancient. The genes above, the purity of the line things she would die defending if she ever believed that the word purity could survive the centuries' pressure. She held the stolen device in a careful palm, the Gene Pure key, she called it to herself, a nickname that tasted like metal and ash. It wasn't simply hardware. It was an artifact of a movement she led, a pledge to erase what she believed to be a moral rot, the gene-modified population's flood of upgrades that had once promised greater life and had ended up rewriting what a person could be. The key was supposed to be a countermeasure, a placebo to the invasive tide. It would block illegal upgrades, sever the unwanted, restore the baseline, and cement the old world's stubborn invariance in the face of a city that had already begun to drift toward something else, toward a hybrid horizon where the original DNA might still exist, but the mind's map was now an expanded library. She weighed the device in her grip, and the world slid another shimmering breath. The square's reality windows opened a seam again, revealing a different morning in a different version of the city, taller, more glass, more hungry for speed. The soundscape shifted, a choir of distant machines, a murmured prayer to the gods of efficiency. The people here wore metallic glints across their temples, or on the sides of their necks, or along the jawline, where a micro-implant could pulse like a heartbeat. For a moment, Zara saw not the mass of bodies rushing toward the kiosk, but the faces of those who could no longer pretend they were just people, but something else. A chorus of identities, some fractured, some whole, all listening to the same invisible conductor. In her mind's eye, the city had become a ship. The reality vault, an edifice of layered possibility, held the people like cargo, and reality waves rolled around them like water. Zara's city was trying to decide whether to stay human in a stubborn way or become something else entirely. She didn't want to wait for the decision to be made for her. She wanted to make it, as fiery and fiery as a letter tied to a brick and thrown through a window. And then he came. Finn appeared between Zara and the kiosk in a way that felt preordained, as if the two of them had been walking toward collision since the fall of the first planet, into its endless night. He moved with the quiet, practiced ease of someone who had learned to live with the taste of metal on the tongue, and the whisper of circuits in his nerves. He wore a jacket that was the color of smoke-soft threadbare gray, with pockets heavy enough to weigh down a man, and a head that always seemed to be listening for a tune only he could hear. Finn's augmentations weren't subtle. The augmentations were a map on the skin, an architecture of borrowed thoughts pressed into the body like a second skin. A neural implant network crawled along the temples, branched across the neck, stitched into the spine with tiny, deliberate threads. A ringed device rested just behind his left ear, a delicate enough circle that a stranger might mistake it for jewelry, if not for the fact that it pulsed with a slow, hungry glow. The designer who minted this genome-augmented citizen, one of those companies that hid behind charity names and community outreach programs, had promised him a future of enhanced perception, of a memory palace the size of a city. It had been a seductive promise, a bright path with neon lights and a soft landing. A future where a mind could borrow another mind's strategies and not get lost in the labyrinth of other souls. Zara's plan wasn't to kill the upgrades, no. That would have been too simple, a straight line drawn with a blunt instrument. Her plan was to hold the line, to keep the human as it had always been defined, to insist that some things remain unmodified, that the essence of identity could not be rewritten by the patient, meticulous hands of a corporation or a rebel with a stolen key. To do that, she would engage Finn, someone who embodied precisely the future she claimed to resist. Finn's lips curved into a smirk as he stepped into her orbit, the glow of his implants catching the morning light and throwing a dozen anxious reflections across his face. He looked at the key in her hand, at the kiosk's blue ring, and then back to her. A question formed on his lips, and he chose not to voice it aloud. He spoke instead with a smile that was more a tremor in his voice than a mouth shape. "You're late," he said, a line that could have meant either raw confession or a boast. "The square is going to vanish without us, if we don't move." Zara did not answer with words at first. She studied his eyes, reading the way the lights under the implants danced along the cornea, reading the tension in his jaw. The tension told her everything. He wasn't ready to fight, not today, but he would if he had to. "Move where?" she asked, her voice not raising, but perching on the edge of sound like a bird, waiting for someone to notice it. "Into the nerve of the city," Finn replied, as if the sentence should have been obvious. He gestured toward the kiosk with a half-turned hand, the other resting lightly on the hilt of a concealed, non-lethal device, a safety measure that had saved him in the past, a last line of defense and a promise to someone that he would not become the thing that had saved him in turn. He wore the designer's emblem on a strap around his wrist, a glint of corporate branding that betrayed a loyalty Zara had long suspected, but not thoroughly tested. The two faced one another in a shared breath, a moment stretched across two worlds. The square's flicker widened into a corridor of possibility. The kiosk's blue glow sharpened, and with it came a chorus of tiny, almost negligent chirps, the kind of sound a city makes when every neuron in the body is awake and scared. "You brought this," Zara said, her voice lower, almost velvet to spare the air. "You and your kind people who live by the plan laid out by the upgrade's designers. You think you're the future, Finn. You think your loyalty makes you safe, but you're wrong. It makes you a weapon." Finn shrugged, his augmented fingers tapping the air with an impatience that looked almost like annoyance. "My loyalty is with the one who paid for the upgrade. The designer gave me a path. The city gave me a reason to walk on it. You're the one who's stolen a path, Zara. If you're here to stop the upgrades, you're a step too late. They've already taken root in 1,000 minds." "The stakes aren't personal for me," she said, stepping closer. The stolen key hummed in her pocket, a tiny, dangerous star that might burn out Earth's best-laid plans. "This is about a line in the dirt that you pretend not to cross. You want to talk about loyalty? You're loyal to a system that eats the rest of us alive." A sudden cold laughter escaped Finn's throat. "You call it a system," he said, tilting his head, listening as if to a distant radio. "We call it the Weave. It's a network of minds that can be shared, stitched, and finally made whole." If your plan is to block it forever, you're the one who's going to vanish. The word weave snagged in Zara's chest, not because the term was novel, but because it signaled a truth she did not want to admit. A city that learned to share minds would no longer be bound to the stubborn purity of a single line. It would become something else, something that might still call itself human, but would be hard-pressed to recognize the old one. She swallowed, swallowing the edge of fear she would not admit aloud. Weave or web, whatever you call it, I don't want to be woven into your plans. I want to cut the threads that lead to this future. Maybe you should listen, Finn said, stepping closer still, so close their shoulders brushed, and the space between them contracted with a dangerous electricity, as if the city itself held its breath. The upgrade you fear isn't about your freedoms. It's about survival in a city that changes its own rules every winter. Your movement won't stop it. It will only slow it long enough for you to vanish into your own myth. Zara was unprepared for him to throw such words back at her, and the motion of his thought, the speed with which his mind connected to the nanofibers and signals that surged through his skull, unsettled her. He wasn't just a detonator. He was a symbol of what she was trying to destroy. The gap between their sides, hers with the rigid decency of genetic lines, his with the supple evolution of an identity that nothing could pin down, had never felt as wide as it did in that moment, and yet it hummed with an anticipatory music that suggested the two of them could reach some landing if they could only keep their balance. The kiosk, Zara said, gesturing toward the neural bridging unit, is the instrument of this broken future. If I disable it here, the city may recover enough to resist the upgrades, enough to hold the line. Finn's gaze flickered to the ring of microscreens, to the faces of those who might be connected to the weave, whose thoughts might leak into this square's reality for a moment too long. He could see it, a web of identities like threads in a tapestry, each thread a life that might become something else if the weave opened the gate a little too wide. He looked at Zara and saw the fire that lived inside her, as a blade beauty and danger bound in one gesture. And if you fail? He asked. The question was soft, almost casual, but it hung in the air with the weight of a verdict. If I fail, we fail with more grace than we deserve, she answered, with that stubborn refusal to yield that made others call her a zealot, a purist, a dangerous legend. She stepped closer still and reached into her pocket, the key's small metal shape catching the light and turning it into a shard of winter. I'm done debating this. I came to take you out of circulation, Finn. In the only way I know how. Her hand closed around the key. The city's reality trembled again, a warning sign that the weave was listening, that it was not merely a possibility, but a living thing with a will. She could feel its tremor through her skin, a pulse in the air that vibrated with the weight of 1,000 lives trying to decide how to be. Finn did not flinch. He looked at the key with a mix of curiosity and honor, an internal contract he refused to break. The old promise of a designer who had given him something he believed would define him forever. He raised his hand, not in greeting, but in a guarded, almost ceremonial gesture. It was the gesture of someone who prepared for a duel, even when the other person stood with a weapon of their own. Zara, he said, voice steady, even as his pulse surged in the implants. This city has a heartbeat. The weave is listening to it. If you press that button, you won't stop the upgrades forever. You'll do more than that. You'll erase future versions of yourself that you haven't even met yet. That's the point. She shot back, a bright, hard edge to her voice. If I erase the future versions of myself, I erase the possibility of a future where this city loses itself in 1,000 variants of the same sad, perfected target. I'm not signing away the planet for the sake of some corporate dream about the perfect human. A moment stretched. A quiet hum grew louder, as if the city agreed with someone, with both of them, and with neither. The square's flickers intensified, painting both of them in shifting hues. Zara in the cold glow of a future she had sworn to defend. Finn in the softer amber glow of a future he had promised to protect. Then, we do nothing, Finn finally said, and we wait for the weave to decide us for once. We see what the city wants to become when 1,000 versions of human look across a mirror at themselves. The tension snapped like a taut string when Zara's other hand, now free, snapped out and clipped Finn's wrist, not with violence, but with precision, a swift, practiced motion that attempted to still his augmentations, to sever the impulse to connect with the network they were about to touch. The blue halo around the kiosk deepened. A citywide tremor ran through the street, a ripple that felt like a soundless shout from the ground itself. The kiosk's ring of light intensified to a white-hot center, and then, with a sound that was both a sigh and a scream, the machine released a wave of pulses, like the breath of a sleeping giant waking up. People around them screamed and then silenced themselves, as if someone had pressed an invisible mute button on the crowd. The square's reality rewove itself in front of their eyes, colors sharpened, sounds narrowed, time slowed to a delicate crawl in places, sped forward in others. The flicker, the door between realities, ceased to be a door and became a river, a stream of possible selves that each person carried within their lungs. Zara felt the world's new breath brush across her skin. She hated the sensation, the way it felt like someone was rewiring the most intimate corners of her mind. And yet, she realized something she couldn't deny. This was not simply an accident of a stolen key and a rebellious heart. It was the moment the city had chosen to test her, to test them both. The Weave, in its patient cruelty, had reached for something more than a simple fight about purity or loyalty. It reached for a test of souls. "Finn," she whispered, not pulling away, not retreating, but whispering as if the square itself could hear. "If we don't decide now, if we let it decide for us, we'll be nothing but a chorus of voices, carrying 1,000 names that aren't ours. We'll lose ourselves in the Weave." He looked at her with something like awe and terror mixing in his gaze. For a moment, the old, easy certainty, the designer's loyalty, the certainty of a mapped future, stood in front of him, and then the new reality pressed itself upon him, the reality of a mind that could be infinite but pulled by the gravity of a single stubborn identity. "Then we decide," he said, almost to himself as much as to her. "We choose what the city learns about itself, and in that moment, we might be brave enough to bear the consequences." Zara's eyes widened. A fierce, bright king lit inside her. Not anger, but resolve. She pressed the key's small metal shape against the inner edge of her palm, where the skin met the bone and the nerves sang a quiet caution. The gesture was ceremonial and ruthless at once. The crowd around them, people who had not anticipated this moment but now watched with the steady, trance-like attention of those who know they are witnessing a turning point, fell silent. Even the city itself seemed to lean in closer, listening. "Listen," she breathed. The word landed in the air between their lips, the syllable a bridge. "If we restore the system now, we could hold the line. If we trigger the cascade, we could redefine what it means to be human, not by purity, but by the ability to choose, to accept, and to carry the weight of a shared consciousness." Finn did not answer immediately. He did something very small and very telling. He moved closer until their breaths touched. The warmth of his skin, the heat of his augmented body, and the cool, pale glow of the implants. These were the physical knife and shield of their conflict, and they hovered between them, ready to cut or to cradle. "The cascade," Finn said softly, as if the words themselves were fragile and dangerous, "isn't just a risk. It's an invitation to a new sense of self. If we push it, we might wake in a city where every mind has a twin, a chorus, a partner who shares every memory. It could be beautiful. It could be monstrous. But it will be real." Zara let her breath out slow, a controlled hush that felt like a dare to the city and to the future. The square's reality hummed in a new rhythm, as if the city itself leaned into the decision and waited to hear its verdict. The crowd had not moved. Their bodies remained still as if bound by a single thread of fate that ran through them all. But their eyes told stories, their pupils tracking the flicker of the square, their thoughts aligning, or at least trying to. "Then we don't merely push," she said, the edge in her voice softening into something that could pass for a plan. "We direct. If we cannot wash away the Weave, We will shepherd it to a place where the human heart can still be the center of the story." Finn's gaze sharpened. He tilted his head slightly, the posture of a mind listening. The designer's emblem on his wrist seemed to glow in a way that suggested a microphone, an instrument used to record voices. To preserve the past, he did not want to lose his future. And yet he found himself ready to risk losing the future that he had believed would be his. "What do you propose?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a dare. Zara released the key with a careful ease that signified surrender to a plan she would own and no longer be owned by the keys. Presence in her hand became heavier, an object of consequence that carried with it the gravity of a decision that might alter the city's ethical balance. She slid the key deeper into her pocket, but not so that it could be easily removed. It would be there, an open secret, a danger that could become a tool when the moment demanded. Her plan was audacious and terrifying in equal measure. They would not shut the gateway completely. Instead, they would redirect the weave's flow, guiding the cascade toward a controlled, deliberate expansion of identity, an intentional widening of consciousness that would allow more people to share experiences, memories, and even emotions with others who were not physically present. It would create a city where personhood did not end at a single body, but could stretch across many bodies, many times, within safe boundaries carefully set by a coalition of minds who understood that such power demanded responsibility as sharp as any blade. The nerve center of their city, the old municipal tower at the square's edge, an edifice that had seen more protests and parades than libraries in the last decade, loomed with the promise of becoming a sanctuary or a prison. If the two of them could reach it in time, if they could align their intent with the weave's flow and with the city's own heartbeat, they might craft a new reality without erasing the self, without destroying the human engine that had driven them to this moment. The plan required crossing the line they had stood at for several tense minutes. It required stepping into the interior of the kiosk. Or at the very least, bringing the weave into a corridor where it would not explode the boundaries of personal identity into 1,000 shards, where memory could be shared without becoming memory of someone else's life. They would need to anchor a new moral compass inside the collective mind, a charter of rights for the hybrid minds that would emerge, the phantom minds, as some might call them, who would carry both their original memories and the borrowed ones. "First, we stabilize," Zara said, as though the word itself had power to keep the ground from collapsing. "Second, we invite. We invite a new code, the weave's own ethics, a covenant between many minds that says we will share only what the body can bear, that we will not exploit another person's experience for personal gain, that we will guard against manipulation from those who would weaponize this transformation for profit." Finn considered, his gaze sliding across the square, then back to her. He did not signal agreement or dissent. He simply looked at her as if the question were not a matter of if they should do this, but when and how they would begin. "Let me open the gate," he said finally, with a quiet steadiness that surprised even him, a kind of trust he had not expected to extend toward someone who stood there, in opposition to his own core belief. "If the gate comes down from the tower, the weave will act in ways we cannot predict. But if we're precise about the coordinates, we can draw the cascade into a controlled channel." Her eyes narrowed kindly at him, a sign of respect that rose out of her stubbornness, like heat coming to the surface. It was not an act of trust so much as the recognition that he, for all his flaws and loyalty to the designer's dream, possessed a kind of clarity that Kohan's old world had rarely offered. The ability to see the consequences before they happened. "Then we move," she told him, the words suddenly light, almost a promise. They moved, not with clamor or force, but with the patient, careful steps of people who understand that every action in this moment could unleash a flood or catch a whisper of air. Zara pocketed the key again, but this time in a place where it pressed against her skin, with the assurance of a second heart. Finn's steps echoed hers with even rhythm, his augmentation's biosensors reading not only his own body's state, but the faint signals of the city's nervous system, the invisible threads of consciousness that threaded through every street and alley. They moved toward the central tower, weaving through crowds that had begun to sense something significant was in motion. The square continued to flicker, bending light in strange diagrams that looked almost like constellations printed on the air. People saw shapes: a dragon coiled around the fountain, a ship slipping between tall buildings, a hand reaching out to cradle a planet. The shapes did not belong to any one person's mind. They belonged to the shared mind they were on the cusp of generating, and it was both terrifying and breathtaking to behold. The tower's doors, ancient bronze, opened with a sigh that sounded like memory and weather all at once. Inside, the lobby hummed with a different energy, the energy of a mind that had learned to coordinate many into one and to distribute one into many. The security constant that usually patrolled these spaces had disappeared for the moment, as if they were suddenly, temporarily invisible. The weave would not yield itself to ordinary control. The city's machinery, trains, data centers, elevators, seemed to be listening to something, more than what an ordinary human could ever hear. They walked through the hollow, feeling like two arrows in flight, a pair of words in the middle of a sentence. As they climbed toward the top, the city's identity began to show itself as the two of them would come to see it. A structure that had always been the same in shape, but was made of countless minds, of countless decisions, of countless consequences. The air grew cooler, and the light showed streaks of a color both human and not, a hue that did not exist in nature, but existed in the human mind when it dared to touch the unknown. Finn's voice, when it came, was a whisper, but it carried across the stairwell with the weight of something that had never been weighed before. If we fail here, we fail every person who ever trusted a map that wasn't theirs to follow. If we succeed, we fail every algorithm that says identity stops at the skin. Zara turned to him, eyes bright with fierce hope and stubborn discipline in equal measure. Then we succeed. We design a compass, a choir of minds that can guide this cascade. We don't let it become pure chaos. We shape it into something like a constitution for people who share, not who copy. At the tower's apex, there was a room, a chamber of glass and iron, that looked out at the city as though the city could be observed from the inside. In the center stood a circular platform, a kind of altar, with a projection screen that could broadcast to every square across the metropolis. The weave was already visible on the screen. The ghostly shapes of countless minds moving in patterns that made the air around them shimmer like heat above tar. The room was silent, save for a soft, continuous hum, the hum of the city's life going through a moment of decision. There, within that quiet, Zara and Finn faced the weave not as enemies to be defeated, but as potential governors, as co-authors of a new human story. Here, Zara said, we become the authors of what comes next. You, Finn, bring the weave's memory. I bring the boundary, a line drawn not in fear, but in mercy. If we bind these minds without their consent, we create a prison. If we invite them to be part of a larger chorus with a shared future, we create a family. Finn's eyes flicked toward the projections, ghosts of people who had already signed themselves into this change. Minds that sparkled and winked out as if they were stars that could be turned on or off by the gentle coaxing of a dream. He saw the possibilities, the risks, and the cost of both. The designer who had given him the gift was not present here in the room, but the designer's name loomed in his memory like a badge of honor and a noose at once. "Tell me how we begin," he said. The words were quiet, almost tender, a confirmation that this was not a fight between two people, but a negotiation with a concept that might swallow them whole. Zara stepped closer to the platform and laid her palm against its cool surface. The touch sent a shock of cold light through her nervous system, a sensation like stepping barefoot into a stream of 1,000 threads. The platform accepted her touch with a soft, almost respectful chirr. She found a mental map in the weave's surface, the contours of a plan that could cradle a city's identity in the palms of many minds. "We will not push a single identity," she said aloud. though the room's acoustics carried her words to every corner of the tower. We will invite a many-handed shared future, with limits and protections, with guardians who ensure that no one is forced into anything they don't choose. We will create a public charter for hybrid minds, a constitutional accord for the weave, one we can enforce and revise as needed. Finn's fingers traced the edge of the holographic map that bloomed around the two of them, a living diagram of potential futures. He could feel the weave's breath, could feel it listening to every thought, each memory, the tremor of a whispered fear, as if it could choose to take a memory and make it real, or let it fade into the background, a note left undisturbed. "What is the price?" he asked. The question hung in the air, a painful, practical thing to name. "The price is consent," Sarah replied, and her voice hardened again with resolve. "Consent and governance, a city-wide agreement on what it means to host multiple lives in one body, or to share many minds in one community. It's a price that must be paid in trust, in oversight, in humility." The weave pulsed around them, a living network of microminds, each with its own delicate story to tell and its own fragile sense of self. The room filled with a soft, radiant hum, the sound of countless minds deciding in unison whether they would be willing to be counted in a choir or left to the solitary echo of a single voice. Finn stepped closer to Zara to speak, his voice lower still, his breath warm against her temple. "If we pull this off, we do not guarantee that everyone will choose we. Guarantee that those who do will be supported. We guarantee that those who don't will not be coerced. We create a safe harbor within the storm." Zara's eyes held his for a long, quiet moment, and then she nodded once, resolutely. "Then we begin with those who want to begin. We invite the city's human and augmented citizens to participate in a referendum of the weave, a living charter that will be signed by the people who choose to share a future. We set boundaries, we set safeguards, we implant within the system a watchdog that will monitor for coercion and manipulation and correct course when it appears." The platform surface brightened, and the projection screen filled with a chorus of voices, the digital echoes of a city listening to itself as it prepared to vote on its own identity. The weave expanded outward, a living map of partial lives, half-remembered moments, and glimmers of futures that might be if acceptance and caution could hold hands and walk forward together. The city responded. It always responds, one way or another, when the ground of certainty begins to shift. The square outside, which until now had only listened and watched, began to tilt into a new shape as the reality scenes widened. People who had stood as onlookers pressed forward, drawn by the sense that something essential had changed, something bigger than a protest, something bigger than a technological upgrade, something bigger than themselves. Zara could hear the city's breath again, this time breathing with an almost audible sigh, as if the metropolis itself was being asked to choose. A chorus of interviews and public statements rose from the street below, a cacophony of voices. The media networks, those great storytellers of modern life, started to flow their opinion into the weave, converting the moment into a global moment, a city becoming representative of a global thought. The referendum would not be instantaneous. It would be a process, a time-laden event that would test their resolve and the city's willingness to participate in a plan that invited a future but did not force it. The idea that the city would be allowed to choose its own path was a dangerous one, a risk that many would hate, but it was a risk that Zara felt could be the only honest path forward. The weave was listening to them. It would adapt to the signals they sent and would respond with its own design. As the minutes expanded into hours, the two of them worked, moving between floors of the tower, coordinating with technicians and city officials who had never dealt with anything quite like this before, and with minds from within the weave who volunteered themselves to be the charter's first signatories, people who had learned to navigate the space between selves and who believed in a shared stewardship of identity. The referendum process was nerve-wracking and exhilarating in equal measure. The first wave of signatories appeared. A nurse with an augmented memory, a school teacher who could share sensory experiences with students across days and seasons, a civil engineer who could visualize the structural integrity of the city's systems by tasting the air's voltage. They signed by a gesture rather than a signature, pressing a fingertip to a surface that read the imprint of the mind as the living ink of consent. Zara stood back, watching the wave of signatures flood the screen, a bright living network that seemed to glow with a light that no single individual could conjure. The city's voices, previously a single chorus, now sounded like many choirs, each directed by a different conductor, their voices weaving together into a chorus that did not drown out any single one, but elevated all. This was no mere compromise. It was a new type of agreement that did not demand obedience, but offered choice, an invitation to participate in a shared future on terms that could endure. Finn watched, a quiet weight pressing at the corners of his eyes. The designer's emblem on his wrist no longer seemed like a badge, but a burden, a reminder that a single mind's dreams could become a city's fate if given the chance. He realized, in a moment of stark clarity, that his loyalty had not only to be to the person who paid for his upgrade, but to the people who would live inside the shared mind that was now taking shape. If the city's new charter found traction, if the weave could be guided by a moral code, his own future would be bound up in it, as would those of thousands of others who had never chosen to be augmented, but would become part of a larger human tapestry. The hours became days. Though their days were not the usual days, the calendar saved for simple tasks. The referendum processed, a slow unspooling of memory and consent, a conversation between minds across the city that was both intimate and national and planetary in its scope. The weave grew, but it did not overwhelm. It matured, and thus, to the amazement of many, the city discovered a new possibility, a form of identity that was not diluted by multiplicity, but enriched by it. With boundaries preserved by a shared conscience, Zara found herself standing at the window of the tower, looking out at the square where the flicker had first summoned the two of them to this moment. The morning's pale light shifted in the glass, a new sunrise that did not erase the old day's history, but layered it with a new meaning. People moved through the square with a gentleness she had not seen before, a carefulness to account for the presence of others who might be sharing a mind or a memory they did not fully understand. It was as if the city, full of restless bodies and restless minds, had finally learned to respect the presence of another self within the same body, rather than fearing that the other self would erase the first. A moment of truth arrived when the referendum results, tallied by the city's central data vault, appeared on the tower's screen in a cascade of numbers that resolved into a simple, elegant truth. The people of the city, augmented and unaugmented alike, had voted for a hybrid future that welcomed a shared identity while preserving the sanctity of choice. It was not a complete erasure of difference, but a celebration of it, an arrangement whereby individuals could keep their most intimate memories and still participate in a collective, a city that could grow by the strength of many. Zara turned to Finn, whose gaze rested on the same screen, his expression a mix of relief, fear, and resolve. The designer's emblem still glowed faintly on his wrist, but it no longer looked like a weapon or a mark of loyalty to a particular corporate regime. It looked like a badge of belonging to something larger, something that had grown beyond the single person who wore it. The city decided, Zara said, voice soft but strong. We did not, our choice was to guide it, not to dominate it. Finn nodded, and for the first time since he'd met Zara, he offered her a smile that carried both caution and a kind of proud acceptance. It was not the smile of someone who had won a victory, but the smile of someone who had found a path through a maze they had once believed to be a dead end. Where do we go from here? He asked. Not out of ignorance, but out of a desire to understand what lay beyond this moment's triumph. Forward, Zara answered, and it sounded simple, but carried a weight of consequence. We protect the charter. We ensure that the weave remains a gift and never a weapon. We defend the line between consent and coercion. we remind the city that the goal is a shared humanity, not the obliteration of boundaries. We become the guardians of a new kind of person, the person who can hold many memories and still be wholly themselves, who can see themselves as a single thread in a larger tapestry and still insist that they remain a unique color in the weave. The two stood side by side, looking out at the city as it stretched itself awake in a glimmering dawn. The square no longer flickered with the sharp, jarring abruptness of two unequal worlds colliding. Instead, it shimmered with a tempered, patient light, a sign that reality had learned to bend without breaking. The weave's breath warmed the world, a slow, steady tide that moved through the city's arteries and through everyone who lived there. And as the wind rose, carrying the faint scent of rain and ozone, the two of them held their own breath to the rhythm of the city's new pulse. The fusion of human and augmented minds, the weave's result, did not erase the old self. It redeployed it, examined it, gave it space to adapt and be more than what it had been before. It allowed a future where the gene-pure rebels could still remember their core values, while acknowledging the value of shared memory, where the augmented outcasts could still smile at a stranger and know that the stranger could become a partner in a broader life. In the end, what they found in the city's hybrid dawn was not a loss of individuality, but an expansion of possibility, a world in which identity could stretch and still hold together. The square's time had been broken, but it had not vanished. The city would continue to flicker, they knew, because futures were not fixed, but alive. But the flicker would no longer presage a rupture. It would signal the birth of something new, an ecosystem of minds in which the boundary between self and other was porous enough to carry the weight of both, and sturdy enough to protect the value of every distinct voice. A weave settled into a patient, sturdy rhythm, like a chorus trained to harmonize the different timbres of 1,000 voices. Zara looked at Finn and saw in his eyes a future that was at once uncertain and hopeful, a future in which the fight would continue, but in which it would be a fight together, rather than a fight against one another. The two of them did not shake hands, and they did not vow to become friends in a simple sense. They did something more meaningful. They stepped forward into the city's dawn, together, bearing the weight of their choices and the weight of a community's trust. The square, which had once been a theater of conflict, two opposing forces clashing in a demonstration of wills, had become a stage for an experiment in solidarity. The doors of that tower closed softly behind them. The city's people, now citizens and participants in a living charter, moved into the day with care and courage, aware of the new reality that had formed around them, and vowed to protect it. In the weeks that followed, the charter's frameworks were implemented with the careful hands of those who had learned the hard way that power to transform lives can become power to destroy lives if not tempered by conscience. The weave's governance worked as an evolving ecosystem, a dynamic balance of consent and oversight, a social contract anchored not by fear of mutation, but by the shared recognition that people, whether born or augmented, deserve the freedom to choose, to belong, and to govern their own identities. Zara and Finn did not stop their work at the day's end. Their paths diverged and converged. As two people who knew that a single act could alter the city's future while also altering their own, Zara's policy initiatives expanded beyond genetic purity, focusing now on banning coercive manipulations of the mind, ensuring that upgrades would always require explicit, informed consent, with penalties for violations severe enough to deter any attempt at exploitation. She also founded a collaborative think tank with members of the augmented community, a space for voices that had once been silenced by fear or gloom, to speak openly about the weave's realities, its burdens, and its gifts. Finn, for his part, became a living bridge between the corporate sector he once served and the citizens who anxiously watched the weave to ensure that their rights would not be hollow. He navigated the delicate corridors of power with a new honesty, using his own experiences as both a cautionary tale and a beacon for possibility. He shepherded the weave's law into practical governance, helping to craft regulations that would keep the network from becoming a tool of control, while preserving the freedom to explore new ways of being. The city's daily life resumed with a purposeful pace, the kind that comes after a storm, when every street holds a memory of what was saved and what could be saved again. There were no grand, cinematic speeches to mark the moment, no fireworks cracking the sky or bells tolling in a victory chorus. Instead, there was the quiet sense of a plan that had actually worked, an intricate balance of freedom, responsibility, and care for the fragile tapestry of minds that now inhabited the city, including those who had once believed themselves the most alone in the world. The form of humanity that emerged was not a single, uniform silhouette, but a living mosaic of shades. People who had always believed that their identity was immutable, and people who discovered, through consent and shared governance, the beauty of a larger, more intricate self that could belong to many while remaining true to the most intimate threads of who they were at their core. The mosaic glowed softly in the city's night, a constellation of lives linked not by a single strand of blood or a single gene, but by a dance of shared experiences and mutual respect. In the square on mornings when the light hit at just the right angle to reveal a dancer's silhouette in the fountain spray, Zara and Finn would meet in the place where they had first faced the edge of their last stand and found a door. They would speak in that quiet, careful way they had learned, two people who had chosen to become something more than their pasts had allowed. They'd talk about the day's small truths, a patient who learned to share a memory with a younger cousin, a teacher who could walk a class through a history, not by rote, but by feeling the pulse of the people who had lived it, a child who learned to listen to a grandmother's memory while still making room in the mind for his own. The words they spoke in those moments carried the weight of a city's hope and fear, and they spoke them with a tenderness that surprised them both. The weave, for its part, listened with patient curiosity, allowing the conversation to unfold as if it were reading a book that was still being written, but with a clarity that felt almost prophetic. What mattered wasn't the victory or the defeat, but the act of choosing, again and again, to create a future in which human beings could hold variety and unity at once. The city's life pressed on with two realities now in bloom, the old stubborn line and a new, evolving horizon, and the two people who had once stood opposite each other, ready to duel, stood side by side as co-authors of a shared destiny. In this hybrid age, what it meant to be uniquely human shifted. It was not less, but more. More memory, more feeling, more responsibility to those who would carry a memory that was not their own, and more humility about how a mind could be shaped by others without losing itself. A city learned to respect difference as a strength, and the most radical of all disruptions, the blending of minds, became the city's most precious source of resilience. And so the square kept flickering, not as a sign of danger, but as a reminder. It flickered to remind everyone that identity is not a static thing, but a living conversation. It flickered to remind every visitor and citizen that their choices could carve out pathways through the unknown. It flickered to remind Zara and Finn that a future could be both fragile and durable, that a single story could, with care and consent, become a chorus that outlives the lifetime of any one singer. The city had become something else, a place where being human wasn't about holding a line against change, but about learning to hold each other and the many selves within, with gentleness and courage. The square, the kiosk, the tower, and all the streets around them became a living proof that a society could respect the purity of personhood while embracing the complexity of collective life. And if there were days when the memory of fear rose like a tide, there were more days when the memory of unity rose higher, enough to remind the people that what made them human was not the completeness of their DNA, but the honesty of their choice, the choice to be more than who they were, to become something akin to everyone else's hope, and to endure together. In the end, the city's future wasn't a single line, but a widening circle, a circle born from the two who began with a fight and ended with a promise. Zara and Finn stood again at the square, the world's edge now a deliberate, careful anchor that kept the weave safe and the city's soul intact. The circle opened its arms, a new dawn spilling across every street and rooftop, and the people moved forward into the day, ready for whatever would come next, together.